Well, it's finally, I say over, but I say over in the biggest quotation marks. Because to be honest, Boris Johnson is not gone. Boris Johnson will never 100% go away. As much as I or other people would like him to go away, Boris Johnson is going nowhere. And even though people have said, "Oh, Boris deserves to be locked up," etc., Boris Johnson has never done anything that actually warrants him being locked up. And trust me, I would be the first person to be out there saying, "No, Boris Johnson needs to be locked up." But let's face it, he hasn't done anything really so far, or at least that we are aware of, that, well, would need him, shall we say, to serve serious jail time. So, as much as people would love that fantasy, and I know many people can see what's going on in America with Trump, would love the same thing to happen with Boris Johnson, that is, to be honest, very, very unlikely really to happen to Boris Johnson, at least potentially not anytime soon. But who knows what might might suddenly crop up? Who knows? But on to, of course, this whole debate that happened on Monday in Parliament. And to be honest, it went, well, pretty much as I expected, with one really notable exception. I made a video, of course, on the Sunday saying how Nadine Dorries, or at least Conservative MPs, were pretty much concerned that Nadine Dorries was going to stride into the chamber and just completely start unloading onto, well, whoever just happened to be there. It was her moment to, as we put it, to unleash hell. And she didn't really do that. And as far as I know, she didn't even turn up to vote, which was, to be honest, surprising, which continues the story of what on earth is Nadine Dorries actually doing. Like I say, she said she'd resigned, but so far hasn't followed through and actually resigned yet. It's a bit of a mystery. But one thing that certainly in Parliament, which you normally do not normally get, is an almost unanimous agreement, with over about 350, I believe, MPs voting in favour of the report and its recommendations, in not only to give Boris Johnson the 90-day suspension, but like I say, he's, well, done a runner. So the 90-day suspension, even though it will be, quote, enforced, is pretty much almost, well, unenforceable, because obviously his resignation is pretty much symbolic at this point. But the big one was, of course, him losing his ex-member's pass, which basically means Boris Johnson will not be able to use Westminster or even the House of Commons or many of the offices like you see many other former MPs even do. Indeed, sometimes this actually gets used by former MPs to wine and dine potential business prospects, or, but just do it for the clout, as they say. So at least Boris Johnson has lost that. So there is, at some way, some small victory. And to be honest, Boris Johnson is at least going to be hurt by this in some way. Now, of course, one of the big none too shockers about this were there were seven MPs, I believe it was, that actually voted no. And of course, they were the usual die-hard Boris Johnson fans. Of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg seemed to be leading the charge, indeed going after Harriet Harman and accusing her of bias. And Harriet Harman basically standing up and doing, as some other MP said, a complete mic drop moment, reminding Jacob Rees-Mogg that not only was she voted in and put in by the House to chair the committee, but when the tweets he was referring to came to light, questioning her potential bias, as he put it, she reminded him that not only did she bring this to the attention of the House, but the House pretty much went, yeah, crack on. So, once again, going after Harriet Harman for this perceived bias. And remember, as a chair, she did not get a vote unless there was basically a split tie. But the committee voted unanimously to sanction Boris Johnson and give him the 90-day penalty, as well as, of course, taking away his ex-MP pass. Then, of course, you had, well, followed by Jacob Rees-Mogg, what can only be described as the Boris Looney Brigade, standing up trying to defend Boris Johnson. One MP standing up and saying that there was no evidence in that report. All 100 pages, there was absolutely no evidence. Yet, if you've read the report like we did a couple of days ago, you know full well there is an entire section of evidence constantly saying that Boris Johnson said this, we found this, there is this evidence, there is this other person saying this. And yet, there's no evidence according to that particular MP. Another MP stood up and said that he would be voting for the report, but was absolutely appalled at the manner in which this had been carried out, apparently, and he would be voting for it, but he didn't want to really appease the opposition, but he was still going to vote for it because he'd asked his constituents for forgiveness, and apparently we should now be showing that very similar type of forgiveness to Boris Johnson. I'm sure the constituents of Don Valley, as I believe it was their MP making that case, going to be very forgiving of him potentially at the next election, or at least not very forgiving of him at the next general election. But that was essentially it. It was over. It wasn't as flashy as I suspect some people might it was. There were some, of course, funny moments. Again, Jacob Rees-Mogg being basically completely dunked on by Harriet Harman, which again, Jacob Rees-Mogg being dunked on is never not funny. But of course, the big absence was, of course, Rishi Sunak, who decided just completely not to show up and have a complete abstention vote, as well as a very small selection of other Conservative MPs who decided that, according to what we had heard, their constituents had said, please don't vote for this and don't vote against it, just abstain. And it continues the fact that, once again, little Rishi does not look very strong at all, as we've constantly said, even though he has the best opportunity ever to get rid of Boris Johnson permanently, not to have him darken his door ever again. Rishi Sunak continues to not sanction Boris Johnson in the harshest way he possibly can by removing him as a Conservative, saying that you cannot stand as a Conservative MP. But of course, remember, you've got the Jacob Rees-Mogg threatening civil war if Rishi were to do that. And once again, if Rishi Sunak is that terrified of Boris Johnson, he must be equally as terrified of Jacob Rees-Mogg in that regard, which, well, I think speaks volumes that he's terrified that Jacob might set nanny on him. And, well, can't have that, can you, Rishi? It's not a good look for Rishi Sunak. But to be honest, I saw this very likely as passing. You had, the couple of diehards still determined to stand up for Boris Johnson. But it just goes to show you that Boris in the parliamentary party doesn't have that support anymore. I think he probably still does have at least some decent amount of support in the non-parliamentary party, but even that is questionable to how much that actually still exists after all this. And of course, even after the more Partygate videos that have since emerged. We'll see what happens once again to the future of Boris Johnson. But as I've said before, I think he's going to become a podcaster. I think he'll become a YouTuber. I think he'll become some sort of shock jock on the radio. I think that's where his future lies, as well as we've seen in the Daily Mail, writing telegraphs about how you can now get this new wonder drug, which will stop him wandering downstairs for a midnight cheese and chorizo. Again, Boris Johnson, man of the people. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a notification link called Buy Me Coffee. We can, well, buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club down below as well. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.